Okay, so turn off this mute. It is 9 o'clock. I'm recording this for YouTube, so no one's in the class right now. Hopefully, a few more people will add in. Um, why? I think I'm missing people because they're expecting a new like session rather than the old session. So hold on. Um, we are going to discuss, for those of you watching recorded and those are dead air right now, but we are going to discuss what's going to be on the exam. I want to make sure that I have it sort of up. So I'm looking at the same things that I'm expecting of you. Um, but I also am trying to figure out how to make sure that you can see what I'm looking at. Not the exam, but that you can see the slides I'm referring to. All right, so there's going to be a lot of jumping around on screens, and I'm just hoping that this. So obviously, chat participants. Got more people coming in. I really hope you can see that. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing for just a second because it's not clear whether or not you can see the exam. Don't like this. All right. All right, so I know there's not a lot of people in the room yet. I'll just message everyone. I apologize for those of you that are already on the WebEx or that are watching this recording. I'm going to try and set up a bit of a time hack so so you can know where we're at. Um, why? Okay. So since the recording's already going, let's get into this. Let's just, even though we don't have a lot of attendees, hopefully more people will come in. Again, I apologize. There was a car accident. I was not involved in the car accident, but there's only one exit from my apartment complex, and the accident was actually in front of our apartment complex, and they had blocked off the entire road, and it just sort of delayed me significantly. So I thought it was going to be faster. I thought they were just going to sort of clear a path, and um, but you never want to rush first responders, right? That you don't want to get in their way when they're trying to react. And it wasn't clear how bad of an accident it was, so just waiting for everyone. There was a lot of cars sort of waiting to exit. So I apologize for that. It rarely rains here, so when it does rain, I think people just don't take into account how bad it is when it rains or how slippery the roads can be. And so there's an adjustment period, and it rains so rarely that people just kind of take risks when normally they wouldn't. And so that caused me to have a slight delay, but right, we should get going now. In the first part, now that we have a couple more people joining in, right, let me get into the polyarchy, and I'm really hoping that when I go to the next slide, it just kind of follows with me. The first part, right, like you haven't been able to join it. Sorry, real quick, John, have you not been able to join any of the chats, the WebExes, or? Yeah, I mean, that's just from this morning. The email I just sent out that I didn't host it early enough. There was an accident in front of my complex, and I'm just running late, so I've been sending out messages, right, to your web campus, the inbox, and that goes to your Rebel mail. So I know a lot of you aren't like right to your Rebel mail, but right, it's there, and then right, hopefully that your Rebel mail at some point is sort of linked to an access point you have. And so there was a time period where people couldn't join, and that's my fault. So that's not like a tech problem. That was I wasn't here physically here to set everything up. So that's just, yeah, I apologize for that, right? I know people are sort of coming in, you're getting the emails, but like a lot of you don't have your Rebel mail synced to your phone or anything like that, so it's going to be a slight delay. That's why the YouTube recording is set up. So obviously, right, this is going to be a mess, but the best part about this is I'm going to review, and then from 10 to 11:15, I'll be on WebEx, but I won't be lecturing. I'll just be here to answer any individualized questions you have, and the exam's going to open at 10. And one of the things I want to make clear is the question, okay, so here we're getting into the actual details of the exam. So I apologize for those of you who basically had to listen for like 6 minutes as things were sort of jumbled. But in the exam, it's going to be one question at a time. You're going to have a question, and then once you answer that question, you can't go back. And there's a reason for that. Part of that is because as some of the questions might have the answer to a previous question. It's randomized, right? But also, I don't want you to just like guess, right? I want you to be like, I'm not sure about this question. Let me look it up. And what I want to make very, very clear is that in my slides and in my lectures is the answer to every question, guaranteed, right? The reading, I expect you to, there is an essay question, and the reading, I expect you to demonstrate that you've read and that you know the material and that you can have sort of inductive reasoning and that you can show a deeper understanding. But that's only going to be 25% of this exam because I got that from the first exam. I got the problems that you were having with methodology, the questions and the lack of clarity in the first exam. That's why it was essay heavy, so I could get feedback on what you're doing. This exam is because not all of the exams are going to be the same difficulty. I want this to have a lot of multiple choice questions where there's one clear answer. So there are going to be 30 questions, unlimited time, right? Take your time, get the answer to every question. And so because you can look through the slides and you can listen back to my lectures, or you can check your notes, right? Or you can check the readings, they all align. And so when you're going through the questions, one of the things that you can expect is that you can find a definitive answer. And if I'm talking about polyarchy, right? Polyarchy is the name of the article that Robert Dahl is discussing. So if I ask you a question about polyarchy, it should be in my slides, it should be in the article, there should be multiple places in your notes and in the lectures that I've actually discussed this, right? And so find the answer to each of the 30 questions and then do the essay. Because the important part is once you open it, you have all the time in the world, but once you submit it, right, then you're done. right? I think if the window closes, you can reopen it, but you can't like go back at any point to previous questions. So make sure you do your best in 30 questions because it's unlimited time, open note, open book, open everything. That's 75% of this exam that you can guarantee that you're going to get right? You can find the exact answer. Some of the questions are a little harder, right? I'm not going to lie to you about that. The multiple choice questions, there's some that are going to require you to think about what you're looking at. I have a hypothetical situation that's going to be like, oh, is this one thing or is this the other thing, right? Some of them are challenging because I do want to challenge you because it's an open note, open book, 30 multiple choice question exam, right? If it were easy questions, then you would all just get perfect scores. But I need you to demonstrate some knowledge. So it's one question at a time. When you go to the next question, you can't go back. The questions are randomized and the answers are shuffled. So if you take it with someone, you're not going to be on the same question. You can't say, oh, it's the answer to number 8 is A, because even if they have the same number 8 question, they're shuffled to where they can be C. Or, right, that because they're sort of, the questions are out of order, right, you're sort of not on the same page. Because I don't want you taking this with someone else. I don't want you to, excuse me, this thing is full of fuzz right now. I don't want you to just say, okay, let's get together and take it. So I want to scramble a little bit, right? Because as much as I want you to have access to your notes, in the real world, you could have access to your notes. What you can't do is if you're working at your job, say, hey, can you help me with this, right? Because your expectation is that's your job, that's your fulfillment, right? So the only limitation is I've sort of made it as difficult as possible for you to work with other people. But the answers should all be there. Right? And so answer the 30 questions, do the best that you possibly can, look for every answer, and then do the essay, and of course there's extra credit essay as well. The essay question specifically is going to ask you to compare Robert Dahl's polyarchy, right? And I can just tell you this because you have all the time and would look at it, but it's going to ask you to say, okay, look at Robert Dahl's polyarchy, and then look at the sort of additional requirements that the Levitsky Way and the comparative authoritarianism reading, right, in their book. They say there's more to a democracy than what Dahl is saying about Dahl's polyarchy. And so is that good, is that bad, right? Do you think that adding that requirement that Levitsky and Way add, is that too much? Or is that not really a democracy? Or is that not really appropriate casing, right? It's sort of this gets back to the Scotch-Moe-Geddes argument we had in the last section, right? Do they help, right? Or is this more conceptual confusion? Right? And by conceptual confusion, I mean, does adding all these requirements water down what it means to be a democracy? Right? Does having all of these different things that everyone can add to say it's a democracy, does that mean we don't have a consensus on what a democracy is? And so you're going to debate, right, the merits of polyarchy, the 7 criteria of polyarchy, which we're actually going to discuss in a minute, and then the additional aspects, the uneven playing field that Levitsky and Way discuss, right? And you're going to come up with a synthesis and say, either you side on the Robert Dahl side, right? You say these minimum criteria and what Robert Dahl says are the things that are democracy, right? And say, okay, I agree with him, and I think this, you don't need to add these additional characteristics. Or you're going to side with Levitsky and Way and say, no, there has to be an even playing field. There has to be, right, a way for resources to be distributed, right? Campaign finance issues are always a problem, right? So where's the line, right? Because obviously incumbents get an advantage even in the United States, and no one would challenge the United States as democracy, right? We have issues, of course, but we're clearly a democracy, right? The UK is clearly a democracy with issues, right? So do you need all these things? And then that's going to be your debate, and that's only 25% of your exam. And then the extra credit, right, is going to be, hold on, right? That is, I have to bring it back up. I don't want to give you the wrong answer and put you in the wrong space. Hey, how this is set up. I'm pretty sure that's going to be a discussion of sort of the 6 ways in which you can have linkage between a weak state and a Western state and a state that's being sort of influenced. Let me just bring it up real quick. I hope you guys can't see this because it's kind of a mess. Yeah, so the extra credit is worth 1 point. So you can get up, the thing is you get 110% in this exam. And that's going to be, you're going to find the 6, right, the 6 characteristics of the 6 forms of linkage from Levitsky and Way. You're going to describe them, and then you're going to argue which one has a really strong impact. What are the ones that matter, right? Versus what are the ones that don't seem to matter as much. You're going to sort of order them and say, these matter more because of the arguments, and you have to make arguments from the readings, right? You can't just use, right, never, right, your opinion matters, but I can't grade your opinion, right? I'm not grading those aspects. So we want to make sure that we're being as clear as possible in that sense. Oh, because we're in sharing, okay. Let me stop sharing for just a second, only because of the way it's set up. So, right, we want to make sure we're talking about, do you understand the consequences of going from a city-state, right? Remember this historic shift from a city-state to a larger nation-state, right? There are consequences, right? And you need to understand these different consequences, right? We know that diversity is going to occur in a larger group. The United States is very diverse, in part because of how large it is, right? We've talked about this before. What it means to be Hispanic on the West Coast is not the same as what it means to be Hispanic on the East Coast, right? The way that people perceive you, because identity is, right, external and internal, right? So not only does the white majority perceive Hispanics differently on the East and West Coast, right, but those individuals perceive themselves differently from where they're at. Although they would all call themselves Hispanic, right, if you're Puerto Rican, right, especially if you're Puerto Rican, you want to be distinct from other categories because Puerto Ricans are American citizens, right? You will hear this a lot, right? Why are we treating Puerto Rico differently? They're all American citizens. They're a commonwealth of the United States. So, right, they might say, yes, I'm Hispanic, but I'm an American. I'm an American citizen, right? And so their expectation, right, when it comes to diversity is different than someone who's coming from another region or is an immigrant, right? And so because of that, right, when you have a very large democracy, there's all of this diversity. And not just in citizenship status or in, right, racial component, but also in religion and ethnicity and ideology, right? That the way the West Coast perceives the way a democracy should work is very, very different than the way the South perceives a democracy should work, right? We've seen this today, right? That many places are pulling away their mask mandates, they're pulling away, right? They're pulling away their restrictions because they have a belief and ideology that their part of the country believes that the government shouldn't be as involved, right? And Nevada's sort of caught in the middle. We're very libertarian, right? But we're also more of a West Coast democracy where we say the government has to provide certain aspects. So diversity is really important. Obviously, there's going to be conflict when you have a large society, right? And then when you have a large society, the very clearest thing is you can't have complete representation, right? You can't have each individual saying what they like. You have to have elected officials. There's no way to have the big coliseum come together and everyone voices themselves in a town hall, right? Even in a town hall, not everyone gets to speak in an American town hall. So, right, obviously there are these consequences of a larger scale that I expect you to know. And then the next part is the 7 criteria of polyarchy. If you don't go into the exam and you don't know the 7 criteria of polyarchy, there's absolutely no way you're going to pass this exam. There's no way, right? You will not pass this exam in that sense. You need to know the universal suffrage, free and fair elections, free speech, access to alternative information, right? The right to form and join autonomous organizations, and what that means, right? Labor unions, political parties, right? Right? Some of these are going to come up multiple times. You need to understand what it means to be able to form and join autonomous organizations, right? What it means to be allowed to be autonomous, right? And then the difference between a legal, like legally I can let you be autonomous, and whether or not I hire thugs to break up your meetings, but I say those people aren't from the government, right? This informal allowance of autonomous groups, right? Is it a competitive authoritarian regime where, yeah, I legally you can have an opposition groups form and they can have their meetings, but I'm going to hire a youth wing and I'm going to have them destroy your meetings. I'm going to have them attack you all the time. But it's not going to be official government behavior. It's going to be this pseudo paramilitary group that doesn't really work for the government, but gets a lot of benefits for clubs that are associated with the government, right? And so we want to make sure we understand that. And then responsiveness and accountability will come up not only in the polyarchy setting, but in the Wright and Geddes article about oil and autocratic regimes, right? You have to be responsive. What does it mean to be responsive? What does it mean to respond? How does responsiveness work? And then accountability, right? Can elected officials be removed from office? right, is part of accountability, whereas responsiveness is, do things actually change when people want them to change, right? We have seen, right, we're in the middle of this pandemic. We have seen a lot of states change their vaccination. I don't mean states in the United States, I mean countries in the world that have changed their vaccination programs, that have, right, adopted new systems, or have changed the rules, right? One of the things about some states is they allow people with pre-existing conditions to go ahead of other people, right? That, because they're at higher risk of death, right? There's more risks to them. But one of those is obesity, and the other one is smoking, right? And so if you're a young person, say you're 21 years old, and you're healthy and you're taking care of your body, and then someone who, like me, who smoked for 2 decades, who's at least 30, 40 pounds overweight, gets ahead of you in line because I haven't been taking good care of myself, that's gonna cause you to feel differently about that government response, right? And all states are promoting that, right? If you have comorbidity, right? If you're obese or if you smoke, right? You're getting it ahead of the line. But many people would argue those are sort of self-inflicted wounds, right? That those individuals cause themselves, right? Whether that's true, right? Smoking is addictive, and right, older people are much more likely to be smokers because of the belief systems that were involved, right? And it wasn't until the 90s that smoking companies were held accountable about the lies that they told. So there are other factors, but right, individuals, especially young individuals, are going to feel very upset that older people and people who didn't take care of themselves are getting sort of set up early, right? And it depends on which generation, right? Or it depends on whether or not you feel safe, or right, you're just ready to move to the next stage. But we are seeing this happen, right? Where accountability and responsiveness are really sort of being tested. And so clearly, that's the 7 criteria, right? You need to know that criteria. It's right in the first part. I lecture on it, right? You should be able to. I do want you to give a look at these 5 interpretations, but I think there's only one question that really deals with this. So not as much a stressor here. The next thing is pluralism. We're only going to use Dahl's definition of pluralism here. Pluralism has all of these definitions that come up throughout political science literature. We're only going to talk about Dahl's explanation. I really want you to understand the tie between polyarchy and pluralism, so make sure that you're understanding that part. So just be very clear about that I want you to understand that aspect, and then that there are negative aspects of pluralism, right? That there are negative aspects. They can come in, right, when one side is more powerful, or when one side is only looking at the short-run benefits, right? We saw a lot of states at the early part, and I'm using the coronavirus because it's, right, this is the one thing we're living through right now, and we could have sort of an end to this by the summer, which would be fantastic, but this year is a real sort of case, right? There's going to be a lot of research on what happened, why did we handle this so badly, because no doubt about it, while scientists, biologists, and chemists, and those who are working on vaccines, they did an amazing job, right? They created a vaccine in less than a year, right? So their ability to respond scientifically is clearly fantastic. They did a great job. But if you look at the political science side of this, governments did a terrible job, universally, right? Very, very few states actually did a fantastic job handling this. Now, there are some places that did better, right? New Zealand and Australia didn't have nearly as many cases. They had more lockdowns, right? But also, they're very sparsely populated societies, right? It's not exactly a fair comparison to compare New Zealand, which is isolated from most of the world, to places that are very connected to the world, right? So that we're going to look back on this and we're going to see scientists, right, hard scientists in chemistry and in biology and sort of in the medical practices, fantastic job. And then over here in governments and political science, just really bad responses, right, politicized responses. And I'm not talking about the United States, I'm talking about globally, right, just a poor handling of this, right? Even if you look at the UK, which had one of the earliest vaccines and distributions, right? Even Israel that was able to offer it to everyone much sooner than other places, right? Even those responses were sort of dragged out. So we want to make sure we understand that this government response, pluralism and politicization really run its face, and the majority interests sort of dominate, right? Majority interests where they were more interested in sort of right of center ideas of the economy and protecting it, right? And that caused sort of damage. Or what we have seen in the last 10 years globally is a very strong anti-science perspective, right? That science has not been supported by a lot of places, and we're seeing sort of the consequences of that. in the public response or in the government response. All right. We're not going to talk about iron triangles. It's a political science 101 thing, is iron triangles or corporatism. Why it's discussed in this article, it's not as important. And then I want you to focus on this, that democracy, Dahl says democracy is polyarchy, and then he adds pluralism, right, which has its sort of components coming from polyarchy. But those are the two things that are sort of the baseline. But then he says if you really want to be a democracy, you need some limits on power. And he gives two clear limits on power. One's a Bill of Rights, right, which we should be, as Americans, should be very used to. And the other one is checks and balances, right? And this is actually, if we look at Polity 4, that we talked about the measurement of democracy in the Hagstrom article, Polity 4 is totally focused on the executive. And one of the things that Polity 4 says is there a check? Is there a check on the executive? The only way we can know if this is a democracy is that the executive has to deal with the legislative branch and the judicial branch in a way that actually makes a balance between the branches have to be balanced in some way. And if there are no checks on the executive, then the executive has so much power it stops being a democracy, because they can just suspend the legislature or they can just ignore the courts, right? And so we have to take that into consideration. Okay. Next is the oil and autocratic regime. I apologize, it's a little slow. Not that I'm like cursed or anything, as a quick aside, but like I've had 3 computers break this year, so I'm probably doing something wrong. So just as part of that, the tech issues have been sort of a mess. I like all my stuff's under warranty. When we come back, I actually have a system in place that once I get my computer back, we can have everything live streaming and then the YouTube and everything can be up. But for now, right, we're going to continue. Like I have spring break to sort of get everything set up. So as we're going through this, all right. So next is this oil and autocratic survival. I do want you to understand the resource curse and how it works, right? That it's important to me that the resource curse, you understand that there is a such thing as a resource curse. Now, what's important here is that you don't have to agree with the resource curse, right? You don't have to say, okay, a resource curse describes everything, and of course states with resource aren't going to do. One, we talked about this in the lectures, Latin America actually used its oil to develop, right? It had a good system with the United States, right? And there was sort of free trade in the northern part of Northern America. So when you get into Latin America, they could make deals where they said, we want to have certain infrastructure. Or you had strong executives in Latin America who said, if you try to take too much advantage, we're going to nationalize, and then you'll lose your profits, right? Whatever investment you had, we'll just say, well, now the government owns this and take that away. And so they use that leverage that they had as a larger economy, right? When we talk about sort of linkage and leverage later, they use that to say, we want to make sure that we're doing something to better our infrastructure. The other thing is the climate, the actual environmental climate of Latin America is different enough that you really need more infrastructure. A desert like climate, and we're talking about Iran, Iraq, North Africa, a more desert climate doesn't need the same infrastructure for its people to live, right? You need water infrastructure for sure, but in Latin America there are more mountains, right? There's more rainforest, there's more foliage, right? It's a much harder to navigate area. And so if you're a government official and you want to get to a village, right, if you want control over that village, one of the things that you have to do, because you might be, right, the geography might be so different that you can't even get your tanks there. You can't even get your military there unless you build a road to where that village is or where that area is. And what you see is in Latin America, this development of infrastructure because they have to, right? It's a requirement for government to be able to get to where they want to govern. And so you see oil. So the resource curse doesn't have to be an end-all be-all, but you need to understand it, right? You need to understand that it starts with resource wealth. And by resource wealth, I mean something that's in the ground, something that's like oil or natural gas. And then in Africa, especially sub-Saharan Africa, there are enough precious gems that like rubies and emeralds and diamonds. If you were in Africa, right, if you're in sub-Saharan Africa, I was there once for something, and you could buy a ruby that would be like $10,000 here, and it'd be like $200 there. Now going through customs is sort of a mess, right, because they're going to try and charge you for the value, the increased value of it and everything. But there, it's so common, right, that its value has dropped out. And there isn't enough wealth for the demand for those things like rubies and diamonds and emeralds. And so, right, it creates a resource wealth that has to be exported. Right, so we want to know that when you have a resource wealth, it leads to rent-seeking behavior, where instead of taxing your citizens, you reach out and you say, okay, I'm going to sell this to a corporation, and I'm going to use that to fund my behavior, right? That's a very different behavior, and it's going to cause a government to be unresponsive. And when you're not responsive to the needs of your citizens because you don't rely on them for taxes, you're not going to represent them in government, but you're also not going to build up infrastructure, you're not going to develop. So, right, that is something that we need to understand as one explanation for a lack of development or a lack of response from governments is this sort of resource curse. The next thing is, we'll talk about this a lot in Levitsky Way, is that not all transitions are democratic. Right? Some autocratic regimes just stay autocratic, right? And we're going to talk about more of that in Levitsky Way section. The next part is I want you to see that they're adopting the theory, right? And because this is going to be part of your paper as well, you should see it like, you should see it the next day. I wanted to go back and edit it and make sure it was at the appropriate level, because I wrote something and it felt like it wasn't at an appropriate level for this course. And I wanted to make sure that it didn't seem so unattainable that some of you were discouraged. So I wanted to write something that you could say, yeah, I could see how I could do that, or I could approach that. So you should see that in the next day or two. But right, when you're looking at this and when you're taking the exam, think about this. Okay, what is the problem? Let's identify the problem. And then what theory exists, right? And so the theory here is rentier-state theory, which we've talked about, the resource curse, and the resource curse and that theory and how that ties into rentier-state theory, and that reliance on, right, it relies on corporations rather than taxpayers and the behavior of that. And then regional effects, right? Obviously, Latin America has a different behavior than North Africa or the Middle Eastern states. And then we'll talk about measurement. I only ask a few questions about measurement. As much as I love the scientific aspects, it's a little too advanced for a 200 course. I do want you to understand it, but I want you to have this cursory understanding that you can build on when you go into 302 or whatever the course will be for statistics that you end up taking. Because almost every one of you is going to have to take a statistics course, right? It's almost unavoidable at this point, right? I know in California, where I got my bachelor's, English majors had to have a statistics course, right? There was no way around it. So, right, getting a precursor to that is fine. And then if you're a political science major, that's going to help a lot. Now, the data set, right? Understand what the data set is, right? I'm not going to ask you any questions about independent versus dependent variables. We've already covered that. I am going to ask you about this control variable, right? So which one of these makes a good control variable? So understand what are the conditions of the case and what do you have to expect. Now, anytime you're talking about an economic problem, the GDP per capita, right? Don't worry about this log part. This is something that you'll deal with later. But GDP per capita should be in almost every economic question, because we know the size of the economy matters. If you say that, you know, that Nevada made $8 million in oil wealth, you'd be like, well, $8 million is a lot in oil wealth. But the economy of Nevada is so much larger than that, that oil wealth just wouldn't matter if you accounted for GDP per capita, right? That just wouldn't have the impact that we think $8 million has, right? Just because the economy of Nevada or the economy of the United States is so large, or the economy of the United Kingdom is large enough that it just wouldn't have that impact. Right, you need to understand the difference between country effects and within country effects, but I think it's sort of in the language, right? Year-to-year change in a place like Iraq will be different than if you're comparing Iraq and Tunisia or Iraq and Iran, right? Those are things you should recognize, but that's not too difficult because it's in the name, right? And it should be very clear in the question. I do want to ask you about case exclusion, but this just isn't really something that is in the questions. I don't think there's any questions about this, so that's not as much of a stress. And then the results, right? We have some of this, right? And I think the biggest part is when you have, I'm not going to ask you an endogeneity question. It's just not appropriate for this level of a course. But what you do have is the theory, right? The theory that exists is sort of rejected by Wright and Geddes, right? That they say, no, it's not rentier theory, it's not recourse theory. The reason is why does he say it's coup proofing? Coup proofing is the different aspect here that we need to look at. And so instead of when we're talking about the impact of oil, right, we're not talking about rentier states or resource curves, or we're talking about coup proofing, that the reason why they're stable is because they have the money to buy a coercive apparatus, right? And we're going to talk about this in Levitsky way even more, right? That if you have an effective coercive apparatus where it's high intensity coercion where you're killing protesters, or it's low intensity coercion is much more effective, where you can have surveillance, right, and watch for people more clearly, then that's going to make things easier for you. So obviously that's going to be part of it when we're talking about whether or not you're an effective and stable regime, right? Obviously, you're effective and stable if you can manage to not have a transition, and that's gonna be a different aspect. All right, so let me stop sharing and share the next one. Just make it easier on myself. Okay. So then when we're talking about measures of democracy, right, one of the things that I want to get at, some of these things don't transition as well, right? I'm not going to ask you about dichotomous. I'm not going to ask what an index is. You don't have to worry about that. You should know the different units of analysis, but you should know if I'm talking about executive versus I'm talking about legislative, right? And executive is the administration that is connected to the president, right? In case you don't remember from your 101 courses. And the legislative branch actually writes the laws. But when we're talking about a democracy, one of the biggest things is, yeah, the legislative branch can write the law, but does it mean anything if they can't actually cause those laws to be enforced? Because one of the things in the definition of the executive branch is the executive branch enforces the laws. But the legislative branch has to pass laws that then they say, okay, will the government actually enforce these laws that we pass? Can we pass laws independently? And so I want you to understand those things. And then obviously, Levitsky, we're mostly talking about political parties. There are a couple of different measures that we talked about. The ACLP, right, is just these names, right? It's an acronym for these names, right? It's really focused on contestation. Freedom House is focused on freedom, right, and these civil liberties. And then Polity 4 is very focused on the executive. So you need to know, like, if I ask you which one's the focus of the executive, right, which one's focused on the executive, you need to know that's Polity 4. If I ask you which one's focused on civil liberties, you need to know that's Freedom House, right? And then ALCOP is about contestation, but if I ask you a question, these points should give you the answer, right? If you're not sure, go look at the slides. All of them are on the file section, right? There's only 5, there's 6, right? So it shouldn't be that hard to find, and the score should be there. I'm not going to ask you, I don't think I asked you any math questions, right? I don't like doing that. As much as I would love to talk about, okay, you know, what does it mean to be between -2 and 2 in sort of the middle regime? Is that a hybrid regime, or, right? That's just not something we can cover in a online class. If we were in a classroom, we could have a discussion, but it's just not realistic in this setting. I'm not worried about that sort of scale. Time series and cross-sectional, these are things that I want you to know about, but I'm not going to ask any questions on this, so this is something for later. Don't worry about scores and numbers, right? So that's that part. Right, obviously the measurement part is going to have less of an impact because I really want to focus on, here we go. I really want to focus on polyarchy, and then a little bit of Wright and Geddes in that oil and autocratic regime survival, and then a big focus I think you can see the, okay, good. Right, and so Levitsky and Way are really the part that I want to spend the rest of the time about, because all that other stuff that I covered, right, I really did the 7 criteria of polyarchy, and then I went over a little bit, but that's about 10 to 12 questions. The remaining questions really come together in this competitive authoritarianism part of the text, right? That's why I didn't go over more material, that's why we're reviewing rather than the other parts. And so this next part is, no, that's the paper, right, which is not part of the exam. Any questions about the paper, I will answer individually, even if you all ask me the same question. But that obviously that's not your focus today. Your focus today is the exam, which is coming up in 20 minutes. And you have plenty of time. You don't have to do it today, but right, for those of you that are watching live, right, the review should let you transition right into it. The quizzes you can go back through, and there's very similar questions to the quizzes that we've been asked, but they should be there. Now, obviously, you need to know that the Cold War triggered this system, right? If I ask you what caused this proliferation, you need to know that it's Cold War, because the whole point is competitive authoritarian regimes don't exist before the Cold War. It's after the Cold War. It's after the collapse. It's after, right, all of these regimes stop having money from the Soviet Union and the West no longer has a reason to sort of prop them up, that you have this transitional aspect. You also need to know the difference between a single party rule, like what does it mean to be a single party rule, right? They bar certain places, only one party is allowed to rule, but, right, that elections still matter, right? They're not completely, and there's typically less fraud. Right? If I say that the opposition can't run, then I don't have to have fraudulent elections, because who else would win, right? If I'm the only one running, I don't need to mess with the elections, right? And so single party rule, you have a clear banning of parties, but not election. And the competitive authoritarian regimes, obviously we talk about a lot, right? That they sort of fail in one way or another to meet what it means to be a democracy, right? And here's where we get the big part of this question. I want to make sure I'm on the right slide here. Is that when Levitsky and Way are talking about a democracy, they're really talking about Dahl's democracy. They're talking about the aspects, right? And they make these 4 cases, and they had a 5th element. Now, one of the weird things is they say there's 4 elements to Dahl's, and really there's 7 criteria, but this can happen when you're sort of paraphrasing, right? And so notice, right, Dahl says, there are 7 criteria, and then I had pluralism, and then there needs to be some checks and balances between the branches. And then that gets translated to Levitsky and Way saying, right, here are the 4 things that we care about, that we think are really important. And notice they add this non-elected authorities, right, that there can't be any tutelage regimes. And tutelage regimes, the most obvious examples of tutelage regimes are Iran, which has religious leadership on top of their government, and then Pakistan, which has military leadership on top of their government. And not that there aren't examples of this outside, but Iran really is the clearest example, right? Iran is a tutelage regime, but it's also a theocracy. So it's a really easy example, because Iran wouldn't say, I mean, they would say they're a democracy because they would say you can have people in charge and a democracy. They would make a different argument, but they wouldn't say that they didn't answer to their religious leadership, right? That's coded, that's in the law of their government, that their religious leadership has a role to play, and it's above certain aspects of the government. They wouldn't challenge that. They would just say that that's a different definition of democracy that they have compared to us, right? So Iran's a really easy case because there's no conflict. They don't say it's different. They explain how their government is set up and how there's a religious leader on top, and that is how it's set up, and they're not trying to deny that, hide it, or anything. So it's really easy to see when we're talking about that, about non-elected authorities, because they would say, yes, it's not elected, but they're appointed by a higher power, right? They would say appointed by God, right? So we've seen this in the past with monarchies, right? France and England, right, for centuries, right? Their monarch was appointed by God. So it's very clear. We know when we say a tutelage regime what we mean, right? And presently, the most obvious cases are Iran and Pakistan. But Levitsky and Way say, okay, this is a little different, but these are basically the 7 criteria. We're just sort of setting them up a little differently. And then they talk about this level playing field. And they call it a 5th requirement. Dahl would probably say it's like an 8th or a 10th requirement, but they're calling it a 5th requirement. And they're really talking about the difference between a level playing field that has an incumbent advantage and where there's not a level playing field. And so this creates another category, right? We have single party rule where the other party can't run. We have a democracy, right, then we have competitive authoritarian regimes that should violate this level playing field in some way. And notice they add this requirement to democracy. This is not a Dahl requirement of this level playing field. Now, Dahl would probably assume that this is part of it, right, that you have to meet some of these things, that you can have the incumbent advantage, but there has to be somewhat level. But Levitsky and Way make this explicit. And then, right, we talked about single party, and what's the difference between a single party regime and a full authoritarian regime? And the biggest part is, if there is questions about this, is that this broad part. Is that in a full authoritarian regime, not only do they stop certain parties from running from office, and there's repression, but also the elections are highly sort of fraudulent. Usually, right, when Saddam Hussein was in power, right, they had a referendum. And a referendum is sort of a weird thing for a president to have. Basically, it was how many people in the state think that Saddam Hussein should stay as the leader of the country, and something like 93% voted that he should. Well, that's too high, right? In any community, getting 93% of people agree is unrealistic, right? So we think, oh, that seems fraudulent, right? That seems fraudulent because he's not the ethnic minority, he's not the ethnic majority, right? He's from Tikrit, right? That his regime was not the sort of dominant ethnicity, it wasn't the dominant religion, right? The Saddam regime is part of the Tikriti regime, which was separate, it wasn't Sunni or Shiite, it was sort of a sect of that belief system. And so to have that much support seems like it's sort of fraudulent. And so a full authoritarian regime is different in a single party regime because not only do they, right, a single party regime has the same barriers where they ban from running for office, but when you go to full authoritarian is when you completely disconnect the elections and what people want, right? That's a full authoritarian regime. So it's important to know, right, you have the competitive authoritarian, you have the full authoritarian, you have the single party, and the differences I just explained, split full authoritarian and single party, and then you might have a democracy, right? And you have other hybrid regimes, but those four you need to know, right? Those are the four cases that you need to know for this exam. I don't expect you to know like civil liberties and what they mean. I do expect you to know this legal repression. Legal repression is going to come up a lot. There are multiple questions that are going to be talking about this legal repression, excuse me. And obviously, because we talk about Levitsky and Way and Wright and Geddes in the oil regime, right? Taxes have a component where there's going to be a couple questions about that. So you need to know the legal repression. What is legal repression? How does it work, right? Legal is often considered in quotes, but the idea is that they're using the law to target an opposition group, right? It's selective application, and it's used to sort of arrest them or to claim their property or to suit them, right? And then obviously this aspect of self-censorship, where the lawsuits are working so well, and if you're an independent media or if you're another person in the opposition party, you stop talking about the incumbent government out of fear. Right? That the law the legal repression gets used by the party in power in such a way that it makes it harder for people to be willing to speak up. And so self-censorship isn't actually use of the law, it's an impact of arbitrary use of the law that causes people to be afraid to say anything, right? And we see this in a lot of places, right? If you're from a poor or really poor community or very with a high level of gang activity, right, you see less cooperation with the police, not because, right, obviously in the United States we have issues with police brutality, right, and sort of police reform issues in the last few years, but also because, right, those individuals who live in that community fear speaking out as what repercussions could follow. Now imagine if it wasn't just a gang, but was an entire state and the government of that state and the people in the government of that state who are doing that same thing. Who would you really call them, right? The police work for them, right? So there isn't really an answer outside of that, and so self-censorship becomes a part of their behavior. We talked about how an uneven playing field works, right? There's a lot of access to resources, right? Private sector, this idea of biased referees, right? You might have an independently elected judge, but they can be blackmailed, they can be bribed, they can be intimidated, right? This biased referees is an important part. And so how is the playing field uneven is very important for you to know, right? And it's all here in the readings, and then it's here in the slides and the lectures as well. When I asked about how uncertain elections are, remember democracies have the highest amount of uncertainty. And when I asked about uncertainty in elections, right, remember that I'm thinking, how predictable are the elections? Not whether or not they will be accepted, not whether or not there'll be violence, right? The United States is sort of really, you're living in a very strange time where elections aren't being accepted as real, and right, this is a very, very unusual behavior, right? At least 100 years, right? For at least the last 100 years, presidential elections have just been accepted. Everyone's been like, yep, that's the election, with very minor like cases or concerns about repressing minority votes, right? Here and there, but never an outright rejection. And everyone sort of thought, we're not sure who's going to win, right? Almost all presidents going in before have said, we're not sure who's going to win, right? And so this is unique, and that democracies aren't sure because they don't dictate the people's behavior. Whereas if you're completely authoritarian, or if you're an authoritarian regime, you know that because you're manipulating the vote, or you're using coercion to force people to vote for you, and so there's less uncertainty, right? And so that should be clear. And then Levitsky and Way explain why they think there should be a new term and a new edition, right? And this part, along with the Dawes Parler hierarchy, should really inform your essay answer, right? What do they say right here in the reading, right? Why do they say it's important for them to introduce this term? What is so important about a competitive authoritarianism that it needs to be discussed as a unique category, right? And does that requirement of an uneven playing field make it so that it becomes a clear difference between a democracy and a hybrid regime, right? And so those have to be very clear. We talked about the international order, right? That there is a lot of international pressure in the way that it works, right? The Cold War sort of changes the system, and then the international order sort of demonstrates that there has all of these pressures, right? All this pressure from the international society, but how does it work, right? One, you have different trajectories, right? And the paths you should know, right? The stable, unstable, and stable authoritarian regimes because of different aspects, and then democratization, so you should know that there are 3 different paths and what they mean. And then the 2 factors, linkage to the West and incumbents' organizational power. Now, we just went over last week incumbents' organizational power a lot. So I'm only gonna spend a few more minutes on this because I definitely want you to open up the exam at 10 o'clock. But also, what's important here is that we just covered it, but you should know this, right? You need to know this. When you're going to the exam, if you don't have this and you don't have polyarchy, there's no way you're gonna pass, right? They are the majority of the exam. So make sure you understand polyarchy and make sure you have this available to you to where you can talk about linkages, leverages, and incumbents' organizational power. Now, they go against existing theory, right? They definitely don't accept this modernization argument where you have to have a certain amount of wealth or equality, right? They definitely don't say that it's civic culture, right? Civic culture is not the thing. You don't have to have a really set up oppositional group. You don't have to have a society that's politically engaged. Those aren't necessary. And they also don't say it's norm diffusion, right? Diffusion where diffusion being where you have a conversation with someone and then that person talks to someone else, and through your conversations, values get spread across borders, across time, right? That sort of aspects of it. And then also they say, well, demonstration effects, but they're probably more likely to be localized, right? And so those things we're going to talk about. Right? The reason why a lot of this theory doesn't work is there's an assumption that all authoritarian regimes will become democracies, and they definitely set that up. They talk about succession. The succession is the critical moment of stability, right? Picking a new leader is always a problem, and we talk about that a lot, right? Why is it so much concern? Why is it a weak point? And because of the dual strategy, it becomes a problem, right? And we talked about this, right? In a democracy, you just want to win the election. So when you're picking the next person, you're saying, I want you to win. When you're in a authoritarian regime, you say, who can I trust? Who's going to consolidate power? Who's going to make sure that I'm protected when I leave power, when I bring the next person in? So in a competitive authoritarian regime, they have to win the election and you have to trust them, and this becomes, right, very difficult. And then I'm not going to ask you a ton of questions about case selection, but remember that they exclude tutelage regimes, occupied states, and failed states, right? So failed states, they can't provide for their government. Occupied is something that was colonized, or Iraq post-2003, 2004, where the American government just occupies the state of Iraq. and then no tutelage regimes, right, Pakistan and Iran, because they don't fit in the same categories and definitions, right? They're not meeting the basic minimum criteria of Dahl's polyarchy because there's not elections, there's not representation, right? Tutelage regimes violate those, so you need to know, right, how they exclude those, and they exclude them for a reason. All right. And then the last part, if I can get it to work, should just transition right in. Hey, look at that, is regime trajectory. But remember, we talked about this a little bit, right? There's a structural approach and agency, right? Structure is the environment that you're in, right? What is the environment that's determined? And then agency is what the individual's leaders do, right? And they start, Levitsky and Way start with a structural argument, right? They say, no, look, it's the linkage, it's proximity to the West, it's how tied your economy is, right? But then they say, well, also, there's a domestic component. There's this organization component that becomes the existing component. They talk about the existing theory, right? The diffusion, the forced democracy, right? This sort of Iraq 2003 where it's just direct democracy promotion, or, right, loans, right, where conditionality, where you say you have to be a democracy to join us, or you have to democratize in order to get the loans, right? And then transnational advocacy networks, right, where some people in a Western state are connected to other constituents, right, in a weaker state, right, or in a state that is being leveraged by the West, right? And those two networks talk and help promote each other, right? And those are all things that are in the existing theory, right, that aren't really the answer that Levitsky and Way like, but they do. First they say, here's the existing theory, and they say, well, our answer is a little different for a couple of reasons, right? Now, I ask you a question about leverage. And one of the things that we talk about is linkage and leverage, right? And so one of the things is how vulnerable you are and how many ties you have. And here are the sort of list of the linkages, right? There are 6. Economic, intergovernmental, technocratic, social, informational, and civil society. Now, look at them, right? You want to understand them. We've talked about them before. And just think about, if I ask you about, right, tourism, that's social, right? If I ask you about transnational advocacy networks, that's civil society. If I talk to you about, Western media, that's information, right? If I talk to you about the advance of the internet, then we want to be clear, is that technocratic? Is that informational? I don't think I actually asked you about the invention of the internet, right? But also, right, how much investment is there? How much trade is there, right? And all of those things are tied to proximity, right? Proximity really matters. How close geographically are you to another state? So if I were to ask you a question and I were to list 4 states and say, which one probably has the most linkage and leverage, right? Which is a high linkage and leverage? And I were to give you, Brazil and Greece and Russia and China. Well, Russia and China are counter-hegemonic, right? So you can exclude those 2. And then Greece and Brazil, they're both very close, right? Brazil's close to the United States and Greece is close to Europe, right? So you're like, I'm not very clear. Well, Brazil's economy is so much larger. And it's as a state, geographically, it's much larger. So if those were the 2 answers you're looking at, and you're like, oh, okay, I'm looking at a map and I'm thinking about these 2, obviously Greece's economy and its population and its territory is much smaller, which means it's more vulnerable, right? So even if they have shared proximity, right, places like Brazil Brazil, Russia, India, and China are actually called BRICS. They're part of this group of rising powers. But Brazil has a larger economy than Greece. And you can just look at a map and see how much larger Brazil is compared to Greece, and that'll help explain that answer, right? And so I do want you to understand, if I'm like, okay, look at the real world and sort of expect, how do you expect this based on the arguments made by Levitsky and Way? Right? It's proximity, it's not normative, it's not addition, it's how close, how large the economy is, right? We do talk about Western response, right? But what is Western response? How close are to you? And then does it serve the national interest to respond, right? It served the national interest to defend Kuwait because it had oil ties and a defense alliance with the United States when Iraq invaded Kuwait in the early 90s, right? So that was there. And then there's domestic aspects, right? If you're reliant on tourism, or if you're a banker in a small country outside of the Western states, you want those ties to the West because that's where foreign direct investment comes from. All right, I'm gonna go maybe a minute over time because I think we're just about done. I know it seems like there's a lot left, but we just discussed this, so I'm not going to spend a ton of time on it. I'm not going to ask you about like specific rebel groups, and I'm not going to ask you about like, you don't need to remember Navalny or the Zapatista rebels, right? That those are not necessary. I don't expect you to know all of the acronyms, just sort of know what they, like, if you're not sure about an acronym, look it up, right? You open note, right? This is open note, open file, open my slides, open the lectures, whatever you need to find the right answer to make sure. But most of these we've covered quite a bit. Within party, I don't think I asked you any questions about within party impacts of leverage. So while removal of pariah is strong and the removal of sanctions, I think there is a question. So one of the things about a party saying we're going to get rid of this leader and we're going to, or an opposition group saying we're going to come in, is they can say, I have a tie with the West. And if you bring me to power, I can encourage the West to get rid of these embargoes and sanctions that are having a negative impact on us. Okay. There is a cluster effect, right? If you're high in proximity, if you're weak, right? That when you have high linkage and high leverage, it works that way. And then obviously China and Russia, right, today are these black knights, these counter-hegemonic powers. They try and have their own influence, which diminishes the influence of Western states like the United States, like France, like the United Kingdom, right? And so while France was counter-hegemonic in the past, it's not now. Right, it's part of the EU now. So it's sort of, it conformed in the turn of the century, right? In the 90s, it was still sort of counter-hegemonic. In the early 2000s, there was a difference. But then after 9/11, right, France has to decide if it wants to be counter-hegemonic and sort of work against the Western states and their economic interests at the risk of being seen as on the other side, right? The post 9/11, there was this divide, either you're with us or you're against us, and France was like, no, I'm with you, I don't want to be on the other side of that, right? Because they knew how much of a war effort was coming after 9/11 to states that were not aligned with sort of the Western states. So we talked about linkage a lot, right? That you should know these things, right? That what does it mean to be high leverage and high linkage, right? High proximity. Are you close to Eastern Europe and the Americas? Do you have an economy that's weak enough that the United States or that the United Kingdom or that the EU, now that the EU is combined into a larger economic unit, can they influence your economy very easily? And then the last part is organizational power. And I just talked about this last week. We spent a lot of time on it. I don't want to belabor this, but organizational power is really their contribution, Levitsky and Way's big contribution. They say, we have this argument. We believe that this is the domestic impact. We believe that it has this great thing, right? That a lot of states just break apart because they don't have these aspects. And it really is this thing that is being ignored, right? And they use the three little pigs. I don't expect you to remember the three little pigs, but the point is, right, that if you build a strong structure, it's harder for that structure to collapse. And that's through organizational power, right? You should know that they're talking about state coercive capacity and, right, the state as an organization and parties as an organization. You need to know what it means to be high capacity, high intensity coercion versus low intensity coercion. And then, right, scope and cohesion, right? Scope and cohesion really matter. And then I think the only, because, right, you know, we know how parties work and that they mobilize people. And these are all in the slides we just covered, right? That winning elections, controlling the legislature, there are a lot of these benefits to a strong party. But in cohesion and in low intensity coercion, what we see is these non-material ties. These non-material ties really matter in scope and the cohesion of the state and in the party, right? Ethnicity, ideology, and solidarity. Now, the thing about solidarity is we look down here, it's only one generation. Solidarity only lasts for the generation that was involved in the conflict, right? When we talk about Nasser, Nasser was involved in a war, and they lost the war, but they were so sort of combined and behind him through the military effort and the belief that he forced the Western states to sort of really pay a cost for intervening, right? That it gave them that solidarity. But after Nasser dies, right, and after the sort of the Nasser regime starts to fall apart, right, those old guard aren't there anymore. It's a new generation. And that new generation doesn't have the ties to Nasser. And so when someone still follows the Nasser regime after Nasser dies, they're sort of ostracized because that's no longer that solidarity tie. There's no longer that cohesion that exists. They give alternative theories, right? But then, right, remember that this comes together and that state and party strength have interchangeability, right? that if you don't have high cohesion in the state, you can use the party, you can use the youth wing, you can use these thugs, these paramilitary thugs you can use these paramilitary thugs to set up a government. We talked about alternative explanations, modernization, inequality, economic performance. They say, okay, that's all well and good, but you're forgetting the domestic factor, right? You're saying it's institutional design. You're saying, now, quick word on institutional design. Institutional design is completely set up on the formal government, right? What are the formal rules? And the biggest problem with this is that the entire argument of Litskin Way is saying, yeah, the formal rules are there, it's the informal behavior that changes it. So this doesn't work because it's the informal setup. This doesn't work because a changing economy doesn't really have the impact that we see when it comes to competitive authoritarian regimes. They stabilize based on state and party organization, right? And those are the things that we're sort of missing, and we need to be able to show this, that there's a structuralist argument, and then the agency component is this organizational power and what it means. So I went over time more than I'd like. I'm gonna end this so I can post the recording, but then I'm gonna go into the next session of the WebEx. So there's not gonna be any recording, but the WebEx is gonna be there. I'm gonna post the exam, I think now. So first let me stop sharing. Okay, so if you're watching the recording, it's gonna stop sort of abruptly. It's just because this is the last of the exam review. I'm gonna post it, and then I'm gonna open the exam.